When I was a kid, growing up just outside Brussels, I lived in a house that I can only describe as unsettling. It was a new build, constructed in the early 2000s by my parents. Not a mansion, but big enough. 3 stories, with plenty of space for my 2 younger sisters, our Beagle Max, and me. The neighborhood was upscale, quiet, the kind of place where nothing extraordinary should happen. But what we experienced there, well, it's haunted me to this day. My parents had their bedroom on the first floor, while my sisters and I slept on the third. A decision, in hindsight, that seemed practical but felt increasingly isolating as time went on. We all noticed it, the feeling that we weren't really alone in that house. You'd walk down the hall and swear you could feel eyes boring into your back. At first, I thought it was just me, the overactive imagination of a kid who'd read too many ghost stories. But my sisters felt it too. We kept the hall light on every night, not just because we were kids afraid of the dark, but because it felt like the shadows might come alive if we didn't. Even Max, our beagle, seemed to sense it. Dogs are supposed to see things we can't, right? He'd bark at nothing or sit rigid, staring at an empty corner of the room, his tail stiff and his ears pinned back. I hated when he did that. It felt like he could see something I desperately hoped wasn't there. One of the things me and my sisters noticed were the footsteps, always the same pace, moving steadily up or down the stairs. My sisters and I would call out, "Mama," expecting to hear her answer from below. But there'd be no response. When we'd summon the courage to check, the staircase would be empty. I remember standing at the top, staring down into the darkness, my heart hammering so loudly it felt like it might burst. Then there were the doors. You'd close them firmly. I'm talking latches clicked into place. But sometimes they'd creak open anyway. My parents insisted it was the house settling, or drafts caused by poorly sealed windows. But I tested those windows. They were always shut tight. And the way the doors opened, slow, deliberate, like someone was turning the handle from the other side. At night, I'd lie in bed listening to the creaks and groans of the house. Except they didn't sound random. Sometimes it was as though someone was walking the length of the hall outside my room. The floorboards would creak just so, one after another, right past my door. I'd pull the covers over my head, squeezing my eyes shut, too scared to call out. Sometimes I'd feel a cold gust of air, like someone had opened a window in midwinter, even though the room was sealed tight. I started having nightmares, dark, vivid dreams that left me drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. Often, it was the same dream. A shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed, silent and still, watching me. I'd wake up and, for a moment, be convinced it was still there, lingering just out of reach of the dim hall light. My sisters complained of bad dreams too. My youngest sister, Marie, once woke up screaming, saying there was a man in her room. My parents searched everywhere but found nothing. Max, our dog, became increasingly uneasy. He'd growl at empty doorways or refuse to enter certain rooms. Once, he started barking at the staircase so furiously that his whole body shook. I followed his gaze but saw only the empty steps leading up to the third floor. It made my skin crawl. One day, when I was about 16, I was home alone. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, so I felt relatively safe. Whatever was in that house seemed to prefer the night. I was in the living room when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs. At first I froze, listening. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, coming closer. My heart was pounding in my ears, but I forced myself to stand and look. No one was there. The house was completely still, yet I felt that familiar prickling sensation, like I was being watched. I didn't stay alone for long after that. When I turned 19, I moved out to attend university. I'd never been so relieved to leave a place in my life. My sisters and my mom moved out not long after. My parents divorced, and my dad stayed behind, eventually renting the house out to new tenants. Occasionally, I wonder if those tenants have noticed anything unusual. I've thought about asking, but a part of me doesn't want to know. Even now, years later, I still dream about that house. I dream about the footsteps, the doors creaking open, and the icy presence I could never quite see. It makes me wonder, was it the house, or was it something tied to us? Whatever it was, I hope it stayed behind. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I'll catch Max, now much older, staring into a corner, his ears pinned back just like he used to. And in those moments, I feel it again. That invisible weight of being watched. When I was a kid, my sister and I shared a strange, tense relationship when it came to nighttime. She's always been terrified of the dark. Her room was lit up like a Christmas tree, a bunch of nightlights scattered across her shelves and bedside table, the door wide open and the hallway light blazing. She said she couldn't sleep otherwise. It used to drive me nuts. You see, I've always had trouble sleeping. Even the tiniest sliver of light under my door would keep me awake, my eyes fixating on it until the early hours. That hallway light was the worst offender. Some nights, when I was desperate for darkness, I'd sneak out of bed and turn it off. It felt petty, but at the time, I thought I was teaching her a lesson. She'd fall asleep, wouldn't even notice, right? One night, though, I decided to push things further. I woke up to find the hallway bathed in its usual glow, the light spilling through the gap under my door. I got up, padding quietly across the floor, and turned off the hallway light. Then, on a whim, I peeked into her room. She was fast asleep, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The nightlights glowed softly around her, creating an almost surreal scene. I thought to myself, why are they even on? She's already asleep. So, I turned them off too. Feeling oddly satisfied, I went back to my room and climbed into bed, relishing the darkness. That's when I heard it. A scream, raw and full of terror, coming from her room. My heart leapt into my throat as I scrambled out of bed and ran to her. She was sitting up, trembling, her face pale and slick with sweat. Her eyes were wide, staring at the far corner of her room. I rushed to her side, asking what was wrong. She didn't answer right away, just kept pointing, her hand shaking so much I thought she might drop it altogether. "He's here," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man is back." "What man?" I asked, feeling a chill creep down my spine. "The man," she said again, her voice cracking. "He's just watching me. I know him." I turned to look where she was pointing, but there was nothing there, just shadows playing tricks on the walls. At least, that's what I told myself. "There's no one here," I said, trying to sound confident. "You're just dreaming." But she shook her head furiously. "He's real. He's always there when it's dark." The fear in her voice was so genuine, so raw, that I didn't know what to say. I flicked the nightlights back on and left the hallway light blazing. She didn't stop shaking until the room was as bright as a summer afternoon. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, made me jump. The next morning, I asked her about it, but she clammed up. She refused to say another word about the man, and when I pressed her, she just looked away, her hands fidgeting nervously. I never touched the lights at night again. I didn't care if it kept me awake. Something about her fear stayed with me, gnawed at the edges of my mind. Even now, as an adult, I think back to that night and wonder, what did she see? Was it just her imagination, a nightmare brought on by the sudden darkness? Or was there really something there, lurking in the shadows, watching her? Sometimes, in the dead of night, when I can't sleep, I catch myself staring at the dark corners of my own room, half expecting to see a figure there. And in those moments, I remember her words, trembling and terrified. "The man is back."